Welcome back to the Denison Forum podcast. I'm Mark Turman, Executive Director of Denison Forum, and your host again for today's conversation. These days, we're all very much anticipating what's coming toward us in terms of our political season. At Denison Forum, we're preparing a whole fresh slate of resources around the election that's coming in the fall and around politics. Obviously, stuff there we could talk about every single day, almost every minute of the day, which many are discovering is somewhat harmful to us in some ways. So we would encourage you to have some healthy boundaries with that. But there are a lot of things that we need to talk about, and we love to get into these conversations to help you as a believer to be equipped to think biblically, to live holy and beautiful lives, and to serve redemptively in those places where God has given you opportunity and influence. And so today we want to have a conversation with a new friend. Her name is Elizabeth Neumann. Let me tell you a little bit about Elizabeth. She is was Assistant Secretary for Counterterrorism and Threat Prevention at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Just that alone, Elizabeth, makes me want to talk to you for about 3 hours. But Elizabeth is a frequent guest these days on national news outlets. She is also the Chief Strategy Officer for Moonshot, which we're going to get her to tell us what Moonshot is all about, especially after NASA's most recent launch, if those are connected at all. She is based these days in Denver, Colorado, but has roots back to Texas, where Denison Forum has its home as well. And so we're looking for a conversation today about her recent book called Kingdom of Rage, The Rise of Christian Extremism and the Path Back to Peace. That itself is worthy of about 3 more hours of conversation, but we're going to try to move it along. Elizabeth, welcome to the Denison Forum podcast. We're glad to have you.
Mark, it's a thrill to be with you.
Well, we're looking forward to this conversation, but as we just kind of get into this topic, like I said, so much, it just seems like politics, partisanship, extremism is just overflowing and in many ways drowning us these days. So give us a little bit of the backstory. Is this your first book on this topic? What caused you to write about what you are describing in terms of this book?
It is my first book, probably my only book. It was really hard to write books. So much respect for authors. I've been in the Homeland Security space for 2 decades. I moved from Austin, Texas, where I was in school, to Washington, D.C. when George W. Bush became president, and worked in his faith-based and community initiatives for 2 years. During that time, 9/11 happens, and it changed my career trajectory. I wanted to go and help do whatever I could. So there were opportunities to work in the Homeland Security space. And I did that as a very junior staffer and just kind of never left, and have been at it for about 2 decades now. And certainly experiencing 9/11 up close in Washington, D.C. on that day left quite an impression that I really wanted to make sure that we never had to endure such a horrid thing again. And when we flash forward to the experience of 2020 of riots and fighting and anger and terrorist attacks, and then the culminating in January 6th, this moment where the Capitol does get attacked, but it's not by Al-Qaeda. It's by American citizens. It's by American citizens, many of whom profess Christ and were carrying Christian symbols, and they were marching alongside organized militia and neo-Nazi groups. It was gut-punching to me, and I wanted to better understand how it happened. I knew some basics from my professional side, but I was really interested in how do I apply that to my community, the Christian, the conservative community, where we've had people that have radicalized and radicalized to violence. And that's the origin of the book, is my own attempt at trying to understand, and then hopefully equipping fellow believers and fellow moderate Republicans and conservatives who are against violence with enough information so that they can be peace builders in their own communities.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that intrigued me in the early pages of the book, because I haven't heard very many people kind of connect the dots, if you will, back to the experiences of 9/11 and some things, obviously some significant pivot points from 9/11 to January 6th and the journey that we basically have taken over the last 20, 25 years. Can you kind of unpack that a little bit more? We're it's sad for me to say this, but my experience has been that it's almost like, for too many people I know, that it's almost like 9/11 is old news, and that's like the old world. And we entered into some kind of a new world, 10, 12 years ago. And a lot of people want to just kind of set aside those kinds of things. But particularly as, being a young adult at the time of 9/11, I can remember I was standing, most people that were alive and adult, at least at that season, they can remember where and when I was standing in the plumbing aisle of Home Depot when I got a call from my assistant that I needed to get to the church that I pastored very quickly. Talk about that connection a little bit more, how these things are actually related. This hyper partisanship that we're now experiencing, this rise of extremism that we're going to talk about through your work, and the problem of radicalization. Talk a little bit more about how those things are actually connected, and go back at least to 9/11, if not further back.
Yeah. So I think it's useful to use 9/11 as a reference point, because so many of us still have those memories and remember we were so scared. The lack of ability to get good information was a huge problem that day. When I was evacuating, we were evacuating because the Pentagon had been hit, and we could see the fire, the smoke, but we didn't know if anything else had been hit. There are these rumors the State Department had a bomb, or that the White House was being attacked, or that there's more planes in the sky and they're inbound. So there's like absolute chaos in DC, as there was in New York, as people are fleeing, and we didn't know what was next. We thought, gosh, if they're this coordinated to manage this, like, are they going to hit us again tomorrow? Is it going to be the metro system? Is it going to be the water system? It was so fearful in those days after 9/11. And certainly it is much easier now in hindsight to look back and see that we made decisions at certain times and places that were probably ill-advised, and could have been done better. Fear is not necessarily the best motivator, and sometimes mistakes occur. And I definitely think that there's plenty of room for retrospective and for learning how to do it better if we ever have to do it again. But I also now, 2 decades in, and having people come out of college and graduate school and come into the workforce, and I still work in the counterterrorism space, it is sometimes interesting that it can get overly simplified. People, when you just study it from a history book, go, oh, well, it's so obvious that we shouldn't have gone to Iraq. Clearly, the weapons of mass destruction were not there. That's a common refrain. And I think it's really important for people to remember the fear that was so palpable for weeks, months afterwards. And there's probably significant lessons to be drawn from a faith perspective. And I'll tie it back to our current moment here in a second. But what I will also say is that in the days and weeks after 9/11, we were searching for answers. Why would somebody do this to us? That there were a lot of commentators that would go on TV trying to explain the rationale. This is what Salafi jihadist theology is. They've issued fatwas, and we spent a lot of time focusing on ideology. What's the ideology that drives somebody to commit an act of violence? And in the counterterrorism space, we call that the narrative. Narratives are important. Stories are really powerful in driving motivation. But what we now know 2 decades later is that narratives are secondary to another N, needs. That the real reason why somebody becomes open to the idea of joining a terrorist group or committing a mass attack is because they have an unmet psychological or social need. And those unmet needs can be bucketed, and I'm oversimplifying here, but they can be bucketed into the need for belonging and the need for significance. Those are basic human needs. Remember going to high school and our Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Those are up at the top. And something has happened in our society to make achieving those needs of belonging and significance more difficult. And we see a number of societal ills that come from those needs not being met. It's not just joining an extremist group and committing an act of violence. It could also be deaths of despair, opioid addiction. You're more open to gang recruitment. You're also more open, if you're a female, to being sex trafficked. So there are multiple ills that come from those needs not being met. And while I don't necessarily say this in a secular audience, I think for a Christian audience, when I say significance and belonging, hopefully what comes to mind is we have answers for those as a Christian community, right? Like Jesus is our significance. We are daughters and sons of the King. Jesus is our belonging. And if Jesus experienced the ultimate humiliation, when we experience the ultimate, some lesser humiliation, we have somebody who is walking alongside with us in that humiliation. So we actually have tremendous, exciting answers for these problems that our culture is facing. And part of what was really hard about doing this book was realizing if we should have those answers, if Jesus has given us these answers, why did our community reject them? Why was it so easy for us to instead replace Jesus with politics, or replace our worship and fear of the Lord with a fear of liberals taking over our schools, or right? Like, pick a culture war topic, and we sit in a moment where we're constantly told all the reasons we should be scared that they are coming for us, that they're going to change our way of life, and yet the Bible gave us a prescription for what to do with fear, and nowhere does it say we should panic. Nowhere does it say we should take up arms to address it. And so what was interesting, and as the years passed and we started to realize ideology is less important, it plays an important role in providing that narrative and the justification for violence, but it's not the real thing that is driving somebody. The reason that matters is when we're looking to prevent, we then can start addressing or appealing to those psychosocial needs, as opposed to trying to counter ideology. One of the things that we learned over lots of trial and error is that trying to counter somebody's ideology never works. It usually has a backlash effect. They dig in more deeply. And so when you're looking for, okay, we want to do more than just drop a bomb or send a drone or send in troops, like we actually want to prevent people from radicalizing in the first place, the answer is to understand those unmet needs. Around the time that the counterterrorism community is coming to this discovery that the science is becoming, the evidence base is building, we also started to see a spate of attacks in the United States. It started in 2015, and it has been going up ever since. And those attacks were coming from U.S. citizens, what we call domestic terrorists or domestic violent extremists, primarily motivated by white supremacy or anti-government extremism. And we also, in kind of grappling with this, like what's happening, why is this changing, started to realize, oh, wait a second, this threat has actually been with us for quite some time. Now, anybody old enough will remember Oklahoma City bombing, might remember Ruby Ridge or some of Waco and some of the 1980s exploits by various militias and white power groups. But the counterterrorism community had been so focused on the overseas piece, on how do we defeat al-Qaeda, that we kind of weren't watching what was happening domestically. And it's not that it just spiked in 2015. It did go up, but it had been there the entire time. In fact, if you go back to when we start collecting data in 1994, the preponderance of attacks, plots, and deaths, with the exception of 9/11, because it was such a large-scale attack, are from, like, overwhelmingly, the majority of them are from domestic terrorist movements that are classified on the right side of the political spectrum, white power and militia. It's not even close. Like Al-Qaeda, ISIS, all of those attacks, they're bad. We still need to protect against them. But that's not where the predominant threat is coming from. It's coming from these other movements that are here within the United States.
As we approach the final day of Denison Forum's 15-year anniversary summer campaign on July 12th, we invite you to make a pivotal contribution, one that will help produce this podcast and other Christ-centered content that transforms lives. This is your chance to be a part of a movement that shapes our culture through a biblical lens, so don't wait. Visit supportdf.org today to help Denison Forum launch into another 15 years of impactful ministry. July 12th is the deadline to reach the $550,000 summer campaign goal, so please give now at supportdf.org. Thank you.
Wow. Yeah. It's so much to just kind of wrap your brain around just in all of that. But so Elizabeth, one thing I want to ask is, I'm going to have people ask me if I don't ask you. You've built this career kind of, it sounded like in some ways kind of providentially or somehow other, stumbled into this career of counterintelligence and counterterrorism. Somebody is going to want to know, I want to know, how do you sleep well at night, or do you sleep well at night? Knowing what you know, knowing the work that you do, I guess and this is obviously a faith-rooted question, but having given yourself for the last 20 years or more to this area of engagement in work, what is it that keeps you calm, peaceful, and gives you hope?
Certainly my faith is a huge part of that. My family and friends, every time I was in government service, would proactively pray for me, and that was a huge comfort. It might come as a surprise. I'm sure some of it is just when you're in a field, you are watching the people more advanced in their careers and you're adopting how they deal with circumstances. So when I would be early in my career and would be reading our threat matrix and, the latest plot, absolutely, I was quite fearful and fixated, but I was watching people with 10, 20, 30 years more experience than me. And they mentored me. They helped me know, like, what's the appropriate level of alarm? Like, okay, we need to take this one seriously, or no, this one seems like it's going to wash out. But also, how do you take care of yourself in that? And it's, exercising, getting outside, making sure you have a hobby outside of your work, having connection with family and friends who hopefully are not necessarily in the same field. All of those things can help create balance and health for you as you do endure quite a bit of stress in that field. But funny enough, I will tell you the hardest moment of my career was not in that early stage when we were dealing with multiple threats, and I was so junior I didn't know how to even perceive it. It actually was serving in the Trump administration, and not because of the threats, but because of the chaos and the people who lacked they lacked a moral grounding. They lacked an ability to make decisions based on what's good and right and true. There was constant lies, constant backstabbing. It was a very toxic environment. And so trying to navigate that faithfully as a believer was hard. That did keep me up at night, wrestling over decisions of, is this the time when you say something, or is this the time that you hold your peace? I'm very much a believer in the constitutional system. Trump was elected by the American people and had every right to implement his agenda as long as it was constitutional and within the bounds of the law. And we were frequently asked at the Department of Homeland Security to do things outside the bounds of the law. And that was challenging to be up against that pressure, sometimes withering criticism, because we wouldn't go past that line.
Right. Yeah. And has been, I suspect that if you want to, there's several more books that you could explore along some of those lines. But let's go back a minute to, again, some of the connection, a little bit to the connection of 9/11 and then to January 6th. I learned this on a personal level, on a pastoral level, the connection between fear and anger. And now in the terms that you're casting this, which I think are so helpful on a wide scale, the connection between fear and rage. Can you tease that out a little bit, and how that really is kind of foundational and fundamental to this idea of radicalization and extremism? What happens to human beings when they are being driven by fear instead of being driven by faith and hope? How does that lead them toward a place of deep anger and even to this thing that you describe as rage?
Mm-hmm. So we know that anger is a surface emotion, and it sounds like this is something that you learned in your pastoral care, that there's something else that's underneath that. It's it has its purposes. It's kind of like having a fever. It's important. It's an important tool to tell us that something is off. But the fever itself is not the disease or the sickness. It's just a symptom. So anger is often a symptom of something else that is a deeper challenge. I in the book and then personally have really been influenced by Dr. Tim Keller's exploration of our root idols, and how often anger is often comes to the surface when one of our root idols has been threatened. And those root idols, comfort, control, power. I'm blanking. There's 4 of them. But the idea is that they might manifest as, a love of money or, seeking a new job, but that underneath it is something even deeper, that we as human beings, we like to be in control, and we like to be in power, and we like our comfort. And when that is threatened, our defenses go up. So in some ways, that's just normal human behavior. The moment that we find ourselves in, though, is one in which we are extremely online. So we're disconnected from real human beings when we're having conversation. Most of our conversations are occurring online. The algorithms, as well as the mainstream media, have learned that the way for them to make money is to keep you angry. So we are in the middle of an ecosystem that is designed to keep us upset, to keep us angry. So that is kind of set out against us as well. If we're checking something out, turning on the news, connecting on Facebook to see how a friend is going, and then you see somebody's feed that is, the latest outrage, somebody's going to mess with our kids' school curriculum. We're just constantly bombarded with all the reasons why somebody is out to get you. And in doing that, we're kind of setting the stage for the definition of extremism, which I use a scholar's definition that says extremism is when our in-group perceives a threat to our success or survival by an out-group, and therefore hostile action is necessary. One of the things that I'm trying to educate in laying that definition out is that the first part of that definition, my in-group faces a threat to our success or survival by an out-group, is like the message that we're constantly saturated in our politics and our media. Like somebody is always out to get us. And it is very fear-based, sometimes based in reality, sometimes not. A lot of times not. A lot of times it's manipulated reality. So it's a cherry-picked anecdote. Somebody got fired because they didn't show up to Pride Month.
Right.
And maybe that did happen. But what they don't tell you is that it only happened once or twice. And then the court system weighed in and said, no, you can't do that. Right. And nobody ever finishes the rest of the story to say, actually, no, the First Amendment has held. The First Amendment actually is stronger thanks to court decisions in the last 2 decades than it was in the 1990s. No, we only hold out somebody who went through a very difficult circumstance. I'm not minimizing that, but his one circumstance is not the domino that's going to lead to all of our religious freedom going away overnight. Right. But if you're in certain ecosystems of media, that is what you hear. You are constantly hearing these stories of why you need to be scared because your way of life is being threatened. So that first part of the extremist narrative, I would say we're swimming in. And unless you turn all of the news off, which I don't know that that's an answer either. It's the second part, though, the therefore hostile action is necessary that moves you into extremism. And the concern of our present moment is that we have unprecedented numbers of people, according to multiple surveys and academic research polls. One survey suggests that we have nearly 80 million people who believe that violence may be necessary from time to time to achieve their political aim. 80 million people. There are only 280 million adults. Like that's getting awfully close to 30% there. And that is an enormous number of people that are what I would can say cognitively embracing an extremist ideology. Now, that doesn't mean that they're going to go out and commit an act or join a terrorist group, right? It's a very, very small number of people that actually mobilize to violence. But the difficulty is when you have such a large group who are open to it, they're constantly talking to one another and affirming these beliefs. And it's a milieu that the 1 or 2 people, or really it's more percentage, the 1% who participate in that milieu who will actually go commit that attack. So the larger the milieu is, the more power and influence it does have to increase the number of attacks. If we can shrink that milieu, you have a much smaller number of people who are like, you know what, violence is okay. You're going to have fewer and fewer attacks. So that's one of the things that I think is less understood. We often talk about a gunman at a school shooting or at a grocery store as being a lone actor, as if they were all by themselves. No, they're participating in the same conversations that you and I are in that ecosystem of fear and anger and hate. And the more that you contribute to it, or the more that we don't start calling it out and saying, this is unhealthy, it's unbiblical. That's easy. Yeah. It's easy to say that these conspiracy theories, that's gossip and slander. It is unbiblical. We should not be participating in it. You certainly shouldn't be sharing it on Facebook. But aside from that, it's also just very unhealthy for our society to be that wrapped up in it. It creates the cycle, the pathway for people to mobilize to violence.
Yeah, and I think so many great call outs just in those few comments. One is just your own testimony about self-care. And that in and of itself is a recipe that people need to hear. That, yes, when it comes to politics and to other things, but in this particular case, it's good to be aware. It's good to be informed. It's good to be prayerful and to participate. But as one of my friends recently said, Jesus only talked about the leader of his world one time, Caesar, who was a direct rival to his title as Lord. Jesus only referred to him once and simply said, pay your taxes and keep your eye on God. So there's something for us to learn about that. So we need to be aware and in touch. But there are certain things, not only of that are really helpful in what you're saying. One is the call out that we are in a media complex that is built on fear, anxiety, and those things end up fueling and promoting, fostering within us this. It opens the vulnerability toward the idea of hostile action or anger or violence in this case, and that Christians need to understand the biblical mandate against violence. Violence in the way that we're talking about it is not the same as when a nation goes to war against another nation. That's a wholly different kind of conversation. We're talking about violence, which the Bible is always speaking to with very condemnatory type of tones. That's not right. That is, Jesus is the turn the other cheek teacher. And we have seemed to become bored with that. We've seemed to become unwilling to hear that in some ways these days. But we have to hear again that we have to learn. And I noticed you referenced Jonathan Haidt's work, Jonathan Haidt's recent book on the anxious generation, some of the influences that are now becoming even more clearly documented about the impact of technology on us, that we have to recognize that there is this fear-mongering and machine that's happening around us, particularly on social media. But then the other thing I thought, Elizabeth, was so important to note, which is why talking about percentages at some point isn't really helpful. If you're talking about 1% of a very large number that will likely mobilize to violence, when that first number is really big, then your problem set is really big, right? And that's
right.
What you're trying to help us understand. Am I on the right track?
You are. We don't have, even if you got to a place where you're like, what I want is Minority Report. I want the government to be able to predict who's going to be the person. One, that technology doesn't exist. The social science doesn't exist. But two, the numbers, it's massive. We have 800,000 sworn law enforcement officers in this country. They're no match to 80 million people who are potentially willing to commit an act of violence. Even if you take the lower number of people who are prepared to commit an act of violence today, that's around 3%. That's 8 million people. We don't have security forces of such number to be able to actually deal with that. The problem is so large that we need people of goodwill and civil society to step up and reclaim civility. It's such an antiquated term, but we, post-COVID especially, have just embraced the loss of all of our norms of civility. And this, it sounds so simple, but genuinely treating the grocery clerk at the store with a smile and a kindness, even if they do something wrong, as opposed to berating them, that is pushing back against violence. When we are modeling for our kids and for others that are watching us, that what we do when somebody wrongs us is to berate them or bully them. Those are actually parts of the hostile action spectrum that we worry about. It's not criminal, but it certainly is contributing to this milieu of the idea that the way to handle our disagreements or the way to handle our grievances is to verbally or physically beat somebody up. That is not only not the way of Jesus, but it's also just not the way of a healthy society. That's a miserable way to live, in constant fear that you might accidentally cross somebody on the bad day and they are going to take it out on you.
Right. And that's one of the things I think we're starting to learn, maybe, hopefully, is that living in fear and living in perpetual anger is totally exhausting. It is totally, totally exhausting. And that's what I love about your work and some others that I've recently encountered, is that so much of this is so clearly spoken to and answered by the message of Jesus and by the teachings of Christianity in terms of faith, replacing and overcoming fear, and then having a trust in God and His goodness, and letting His Spirit fill us with His fruit of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness. Those things manifesting in our lives can turn this tide back, and is so needed, because if so much of our audience is feeling like, every time I turn around, there's another one of these horrific kind of experiences. that seem to be all around us. Well, like I said, it goes back to that math equation, right? If your initial number is really big and you have this many people that are that subset is trending toward violence, then, as you said, we can't create enough security measures. We can't raise up enough police officers to contend with the numbers. The numbers just don't work in our favor. We have to come up with another solution.
That's right.
So you talk about in your book about not just extremism, but particularly you're calling out Christian extremism and how what we've seen, particularly over the last 10 to 15 years, is the co-opting of Christian faith, the co-opting of a basic understanding of what Christianity is, and the merging of that with politics, particularly right and far right politics. And it starts circling around these words, grievance and victimization. Explain some of that to us, how that has become this very unexpected, but now more and more clearly this reality of how Christian faith has been co-opted for these purposes.
Yeah, so historically, Christianity has been used by white power movements, by anti-government movements. So in some senses, this is not new. What's new is that there's a convergence of those more organized and traditional extremist movements and what some call a mass political violence movement, which kind of is what we saw on January 6th. But it's this merger of people that are by definition extremist with people that are otherwise normal. Like they're not going out and reading and writing extremist literature. They're not doing a training camp. They just are really upset at the politics of the day. And so they're increasingly spending time and space with legitimate extremists. So one concern is that it makes it easier for those groups to recruit people into them. If they're literally showing up at the same protest, and we actually see this happen online all the time, where an extremist group will say there's going to be a protest against transgender rights or at Pride Month, legitimate political speech, right? Like that, they're not, the people protesting are not intending harm; they're just protesting. And we see the extremist movements online go, well, let's go join them. And it's a little disconcerting because you don't know, are they going to join to actually instigate something to actually cause some violence or melee to occur? Or is what they're doing going to meet people to become friends and then eventually, inviting them deeper and deeper into their dark world? And there are stories of this. I mean, I've met people who've been like, yeah, I moved to this area and met some people, was friends with them for 6 months. And then I found out that they were white power people and they are no longer my friends, but that they actively recruit from people that they perceive to be open or vulnerable to their beliefs. And so that is happening. So that's one concern I have. But there's another thing that's happening, and this is much more at the feet of mainstream republicanism, as it is right now, mainstream, and Christians who are participating in it, and that is people who have really turned their religion into politics. Like their faith is in a politician or a political party or their MAGA movement, and in doing so, they're weaving together narratives, all of which are grievous, right? Like everything is against them. Everything is going to come get them. But for Donald Trump, who is going to save them, but for the Republican Party, which is going to fix our country. And for some people, they become much more open to messages that do come out from politicians, from influencers, that it's not just about your vote. It is about being willing to take up arms. So back in April, Carrie Lake, who is running for Senate in Arizona, made a statement at a rally that not only do we need to put on our armor of God, we might need to strap on a Glock too. And so you have politicians who are using language that will influence, it's a small percentage, but will influence people to think that I got to be ready for a fight. We are seeing some of the crowds that were at January 6th start to reactivate online. The Proud Boys in particular are regrouping. There are indications that some of the trials that the former president is going through is leading people to, not only are they making verbal threats, but we are seeing some planning happening where people are stockpiling weapons. They're making plans for where they need to go protest. And maybe that's all they're going to do is protest. But there are active threats against the judges, against the jury members. And for those who are on the receiving end of those threats, even if it was just that, a verbal threat, and they didn't intend anything, it is quite scary for a member of the public or a member of a judge's family. They don't have police protection. They don't have, most people can't afford it. I mean, it right. is quite terrifying to be on the receiving end of those threats. And so there are quite a number of people in this movement that are at least on that lower end of the hostile action spectrum, verbally harassing, bullying, and then sometimes crossing into the criminal space where they might physically show up and start stalking people, or some types of verbal threats can be criminally prosecuted, but it is kind of hard to do. So we do have a reactivated political violence movement. It's not that it went away. It's just that the moment, being in an election, and the former president going through a number of court cases, all of those right. are creating more opportunities for people to cross into that hostile action space of, we got to do something about this. So I want to circle back to the Christian extremism label, because I struggled with whether to call it that. It really is this confluence of several different movements, but I chose to frame it that way to be direct. One is because the faith has been co-opted, but two is there are parts of our community that are letting it be co-opted. Like we could be pushing back much stronger. After 9/11, we asked the Muslim community, please push back against this narrative that violent jihad is the only way to commit the jihad called for in your scriptures. Please, right. Please tell your followers that the Muslim faith can be practiced peacefully. So if we ask that of the Muslim community, shouldn't the Christian community be able to acknowledge that there were brothers and sisters in Christ on the Capitol grounds on January 6th? There are brothers and sisters in Christ that deny that was a violent day, that view what happened on that day as an act of patriotism, not an act of violence that led to 5 deaths and 140 plus people that were injured. We need to call those out for what it is. They are lies, and we are right. supposed to be people of the truth. So I'm not suggesting that everybody that attends a Christian church is responsible for what happened on January 6th, but I am saying this is a moment that we need to take stock and examine where have I not stood up and pushed back against slander and gossip and that lower end of the hostile action spectrum? Where have I not said, no, we need to speak the truth here, and that is a conspiracy theory, and we don't know that it's true? Like that's really important for us to be salt and light. We have to start within our own community and requiring people to tell the truth and not traffic in fear and lies.
Yeah, because I think what you're pointing out is that, sometimes just simply by our silence, we're failing to be salt and light. We become complicit in a way by omission, simply by not using our influence, not using our voice, not calling things out when we can in an appropriate way with clarity and with integrity. Then we're love. Putting ourselves in a place of becoming complicit. Elizabeth, along that line, one of the things that was really helpful clarifying in kind of a new aha moment for me was when you talked about in your early days of your career, right after 9/11, you became very focused, and the whole essence of what was going on was trying to identify the next, what you define as a complex coordinated attack, which is what 9/11 was. It was a complex coordinated attack by almost 24 individuals, and all synchronized to work in a certain way, and that there were great concerns that there were more of those coming. But I think it was a really helpful call out to say, we've really pivoted to something that's not only internal to our citizens rather than external with foreign groups or powers. That's still there, probably will always be there. We think in terms of, threats coming from things like China, Russia, other groups, cyber types attacks. We know that those are there. We know that there are always going to be that. There's going to be that pursuit of complex coordinated attack. But what you've called out in this book is a more individualized radicalization. And you've already referred to it, but I want you to go back to the connection between need, narrative, and network. We talked about need and narrative a minute, but how does network come into this? Because all of that's been aided by what you mentioned a moment ago about technology.
Yes.
How is that setting this up and really leveraging the vulnerability of people toward extremism?
Yeah. So in the 3 N's, needs, networks, and narratives, traditionally, if you were to ask this question, say in 2008, the network is the thing that allows a terrorist attack or a terrorist group to come together and attack to be planned. And you needed lots of different people. You needed fundraisers. You needed somebody to coordinate travel. You needed somebody to be on the receiving end because you were sending people from overseas into the United States. Somebody had to set them up, get them a house, get them a job, get them a car. And usually the way that terrorist organizations worked is that everybody knew what their job was, but nobody knew what the other person's job was. They used cutouts so that if you took out one person, you weren't taking out the whole network, and that person wouldn't give up the secrets. They could only give up 1 or 2 people that they might know. So we call that cell style terrorism, where little cells have a certain responsibility, but they rely on other cells to make it work. So when you would look at the network, that was really helpful for us to be able to understand, like, where's the money coming from? Or we see a lot of travel activity out of this area. So we should assume that maybe that's where their training camp is. So you're looking for dots on a map and trying to figure out what the different dots were responsible for. And if you could connect the dots, then you can kind of paint the picture of what might be being planned and how to possibly thwart it. Back then, the answer to the network was cut off the head of the snake. If you could get either the top guy or the second in command, you would disrupt the process. Because if you took out somebody lower down the chain, they can easily replace them. That was the theory.
Right.
Today, you can plan a terrorist attack without ever leaving your house. And ISIS really changed this for us. Although in some ways it could be argued that the militia and white power movement actually started the online extremist movement back in the 1980s. They were the first to share propaganda through computer networks. They were the first to try to do things in certain networks secretly so law enforcement couldn't detect them. So the idea of using the internet to share propaganda and plans has been around for quite some time, but ISIS really was able to capture the social media moment and make terrorism, kind of fun and interesting and viral, if you will, for a younger generation. So we had a number of people initially leave the United States and fly over to Iraq and Syria to join ISIS. That was kind of the initial version of ISIS. Is you could find them on your social media platform of choice. And then they would connect you to somebody who could give you instructions on how to get there. ISIS started to falter. They started to lose territory as the Western forces started to push to fight back against them. And so at some point, ISIS says, don't come here. The best way you can contribute to the cause is to fight where you are. You find a weapon that you have access to, and just create havoc and do it in the name of ISIS. And so in Europe, what you would see were vehicle ramming attacks and knife attacks. In the United States, you would mostly see gun attacks, but we also had some vehicle ramming attacks as well. So there was this decentralization of knowledge, and that, here's how you. I think they tried to do some bomb making stuff, but bomb making turns out to be a little hard. So it really was find a gun, find a knife, find a vehicle, and you can do this for the glory of ISIS. And what we see from that moment is we no longer need a sophisticated network. We already have one in our phones. And the other thing that shifted, thanks to social media, is the rate at which people radicalized. Before 2010, it took about 5 years to somebody from first exposure to extremism to actually becoming an extremist. Now it's, I want to say one study says, but the study stated it's more like 18 months. We have examples of people that have radicalized, meaning exposure to planning an attack, 1 week. That is how quickly it can go. So it is completely game changing for law enforcement to go from something that took years to plan and years for somebody to get recruited and radicalized. You have a lot of time to plot those dots on the map and try to figure out what's happening, to now, tomorrow, somebody might stumble across a website, become enamored, go down a rabbit hole, and a week from now plan an attack. Like that, it is impossible for law enforcement to detect that. That's why so much of our public messaging right now is about bystanders, asking bystanders to report if they think their loved one is in danger of doing something, or if they just think that they need help. It is really, really difficult. Once the process has started, if they're already vulnerable, they can radicalize pretty quickly.
And that's where you start seeing things like these initiatives of, if you see something, say something, right? Those kinds of things start to grow because this problem of extremism is accelerating and is accelerating at an alarming rate on a very individualized kind of way, which is why I think the latter half of your book is so important, which is that there is hope in this story. There are ways to turn people away from radicalization. And like I said, just starting with the realization that fear and anger are exhausting in and of themselves. At one point in the book, you call out in the hope section of the book that extremism is like unto a drug addiction. Families that have been caught up in this. That's something to remember, that every quote unquote lone actor who becomes radicalized and actually chooses to engage violence, they have a family. They came from a family. They came from a community where something went wrong. A number of things went wrong. But you give a lot of information, a lot of help, a lot of insight into how to identify people that are moving down the road toward radicalization, and what are some things that a family member can do or a neighbor could do. Speak to some of those things, and even take it to the point of I'm wondering if there's a church leader, a pastor, a deacon, an elder listening to this, and they're thinking, well, what could my church do? What could I do in my neighborhood? What could my church do in our community that could help with this problem?
So in the book, in the appendices of the book, a lot of detail is laid out for you to help you think through whether the person you're concerned about is radicalizing and or if they're at risk of violence. Those are two separate categories. But one of the things I love to start with, and I'll start with kind of the question of what can churches do. We have got to start talking to our kids about this, just like we talk to our kids about drugs and sex. We need to be talking to our kids about the extremism that they already encounter online. They might not realize it's extremism, but it's so pervasive in the gaming communities and in the social media platforms that youth are involved in that they have come across it. So we want to open the conversation, talk to them about it. And I list out some suggestions of how you have a conversation with the 8 to 12 range and how you have a conversation with teens. And just like every other kind of parenting advice we get in terms of, how to talk to your kids about drugs and sex, the goal here is to start a conversation and continue a conversation so that if they see something online, they're coming to you to ask you about it. If they see concerning behavior in one of their friends, they're coming to you to talk about it. Like, the goal is not, you got to know all of this, and neither can you, a parent, keep up with this. Like, the way that extremism morphs and changes online happens it is so atomized right now, and it happens like on a day-to-day basis. The narratives are constantly in flux. There'd be a whole other podcast to talk about some of the very weird versions of extremism that are manifesting online right now. So the goal is not for you to be an expert. The goal is for you to have that open dialogue with your kids, and really, as Christian parents, and where the church can help is let's go back to what Scripture teaches about how we think about people with whom we disagree. I keep mentioning it, but it's really important. Gossip and slander. Bible is really clear about that. And participating in conspiracy theories or sharing a post that's making fun of a politician that you don't like, that is gossip and slander. And we need to treat that with the same seriousness that we address sexual perversion. Like, we spend way more time focused on non-believers' sin as opposed to the sin that we are committing as believers. And I think when we are catechizing our kids, we want to draw connections to the way that this manifests today, and help them have a biblical basis, not just hey, it's bad to be a racist. No.
Right.
It's not because the world says racism is bad. It's because God made us all in His image, and like, here's what we believe that means, and here's how we live our life because of that. It's not only that we don't put somebody down because they look differently than us or have different skin color. It's that we also have God's heart for justice, and we have God's heart for those that are marginalized. And we practice and live that out by, fill in the blank. Every family might be different, but by serving the refugee community in your area, by serving alongside people of color who you might not see on a daily basis, like exposing our kids to other communities who are suffering is an important way to humanize, so that when those dehumanizing messages come in from extremist groups, there's an inoculation built in that we call that protective factors. And proximity is one of the most important ways we can build protective factors. When you actually know somebody from the group that's being othered, you tend to be like, no, that's not actually how it is. They're a nice person. And, no, that's not true. So I spent a lot of time, and I think it would be great for churches to get educated on what we can do to better train our youth in this. And I think also I focus on that because when we talk about protecting our kids, we tend to be a little more open about maybe the ways that we're participating in things and not doing things well. So it's sometimes an easier way to have those tough conversations with adults who might be participating in that lower end of the hostile action spectrum, who might be overly idolatrous with their politics. There are two other appendices. One is recognizing risk factors for radicalization. And then the other is behavioral indicators of people mobilizing to violence. That latter category, if you detect some of these, that's when you call law enforcement. Before you're detecting those, it kind of depends on where you're located. There are a number of resources now that I link to in the book, and they're on my website, where you can work with a trained psychologist to help somebody who is radicalizing, or once maybe they are radicalized and they want to leave, they want to disengage. There are increasingly more trained mental health professionals who can help somebody who is in that space. You do want to work with somebody that has been specially trained in this, though. You don't want to just pick somebody out of the phone book, because there is a little bit of a methodology behind the best way to treat somebody, much like we use trained professionals for addiction processes and leaving a cult. It is very much the reason why people radicalize. It becomes a part of their identity, and there are surface issues, and then there's a lot of other stuff that needs to be dealt with. And you want to work with somebody that is trained to know the proper way to do that.
Yeah. So as we talk about in church often, hopefully, is that asking for help when you realize that you need outside expertise, that's not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of wisdom. It's a recognition that, hey, we need some outside resources to help, because, most of us are not trained in those levels of intervention and interception in some ways. Makes me think that so much of what you're talking about is just really good, healthy discipleship that can and should happen within the home. That as parents, Christian parents, pour into their kids, not just taking them to church, but living this out and talking this through on a day-by-day basis and all kinds of different experiences. I think you made reference to how in Jewish families, the father is the first rabbi to the family for training them and discipling them, and then extending that into the church, that these things need to be taught and reinforced within the church as well. It also made me think, Elizabeth, of one of our team members who told us his story not long ago in an all-team meeting where, as a young 18, 20-year-old, he said, in terms of faith at that season of my life, I was easily led. And then he went on to say he intersected with a cult, and he said, I was easily misled. Mm-hmm. And he went for an extended season of his life into something that was very ungodly and something that was very unbiblical, because he had needs and because there was a narrative that was presented to him, and then there was a network that facilitated it. Those things are still operating, and they still create that kind of vulnerability that all of us need to be aware of for ourselves, but also for our children and other people that are under our care and our influence. Just for a moment before we wrap up, Elizabeth, tell us what you're doing now. You're not in the federal government these days, but what are you doing now? Because you're still working in some of these same areas, just in a different context. So what are you up to?
That's right. Well, aside from talking about the book, and I do occasionally, excuse me. Went down the wrong pipe. It's a good thing you can cut.
Yeah, we'll smooth all that out.
Oh, let's see. Can I talk? Yeah. Okay, let's see if I can wrap this up. Okay, so aside from promoting the book, and I do occasionally speak to church groups and pastors and Christian leaders about these topics, I am Chief Strategy Officer at Moonshot, which does not send rockets into space, though that was my girlhood dream, was to be an astronaut. So I'm really excited about the recent rocket launches, and I'm super excited that maybe someday I can go to space. But no, Moonshot is a company that works to intervene with people that are radicalizing online and redirect them to mental health support. So we come from a place of believing that everybody can change, and that sometimes when people are searching for content in the dark spaces online, they can be open to getting that help. And we have, I'm very proud of the company. I can't claim credit myself, but we have thwarted a number of attacks through this methodology. So it's not the whole set of tools that we need in the country, but it is certainly a really important tool to be able to reach people where the radicalization is happening.
Yeah, what a great, just core Christian message, right? Anyone can change. And if we lose that conviction and that hope, we've lost our hold on the gospel, because that's the whole message of what Jesus is saying. Jesus is saying, everybody is welcome and anything is possible because God is so full of grace, and anyone can change because of that. And so Such a great message. And again, Elizabeth, just thank you for this work. So important for people to understand and to get a hold of this. Let me remind you again, it is the book called Kingdom of Rage, The Rise of Christian Extremism and the Path Back to Peace. So many more things I'd love to talk with you about. Maybe we can have you back for a follow-up conversation, but been so helpful today. Want to thank you and ask God to bless your work going forward. And also want to thank our audience for listening. And hopefully this has been encouraging and helpful to you. Would encourage you to get the book and read through all of what Elizabeth is expressing and explaining to us. And again, want to thank you for following us. If you have been helped, please rate, review our podcast on your podcast platform. Share this with family and friends. And again, thank you for supporting Denison Forum. We are a donor-based ministry, and we could not do what we do to equip believers in walking with God without your help. And so we're grateful. Elizabeth, we hope to see you again soon.
Thanks, Mark. It was a pleasure to join you.